You are listening to the Cookbook Love podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 314.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. How's everybody doing today? Hope you're having a great September so far, and I am excited to be here after my weekly run to Kroger this morning. As always, I head to the supermarket usually about once a week, stock up for things that we need in our house to cook, and that hasn't really changed a lot with just the two of us here now. I still commit to that, having fresh ingredients in the house because of the value that I place in not only with cooking, totally enjoy that, but also with feeding myself well. And I had a little bit of a light bulb moment while I was at Kroger based on a podcast I was listening to about course creators and people who make digital courses. And the gentleman who was talking on the podcast said that most of the time, a lot of his students in creating courses think that they need to have a lot of confidence and capacity and income before they actually create the course. And he said what he has learned over the years is that it is through the work of launching the course and making the course that people actually gain confidence and capacity and clarity. And then, of course, they go on to create more income and more legacy. And it occurred to me how similar that is for publishing books. You know, before I published my first book, and I have to admit, sometimes this still rears its head. I know it does with my students. We feel inadequate. We feel time-starved, doubtful, afraid. We don't think that we're ever going to follow through on another project, so why should we even start? So then we sit around and we wait for our doubt to disappear, or time to magically appear, or confidence to surge before we actually work on our cookbook project or self-published it. And guess what? Typically when we do that, we never actually publish our books. And why is that? It's because it's the going through the work of publishing that we gain the confidence and we learn to master time and we follow through on the project. It's not that we get those things before, it's because we go through it. And it's the same for everything I've done in my life. And I don't know why this just was such a light bulb moment for me this morning. I became a better mother by going through the process of mothering my children. I became a better mother to infants by having infants, to toddlers by having toddlers, to school-age children by having school-age children, to high schoolers and college students by having them and going through it. And now the same thing for being the parent of adult children. I'll learn all about that and gain the confidence that I need and the clarity that I need to be the mother I need to be by going through it. And it is so true with our books. I made a short list of all the things I've learned through publishing, and I probably could list many more, but I thought that I would just share this with you because it was through cookbook writing that I learned how to complete projects. I started to believe in myself and my ideas and that they were good enough to publish. I stop overthinking. I show up for myself. I show up for my project. I decide and I focus. I learn how to give myself permission to make money and write books using the gifts I've been given. I learned how to be loyal to my clients and still write books of my own. I learned how to follow routines and care for myself when I'm publishing and writing. And the list goes on and on and on. And I thought about that today, even as I was thinking about the introduction for the guests that I have on the show. And I rarely talk about these unintended byproducts of publishing books, but it's really true. And it's often why many cookbook authors go on to write more than one book. And that's because once they figure this out, they have the confidence and the clarity and more courage to continue to write books. There are so many things that we learn from writing cookbooks that we would never learn unless we actually go through the process of writing them and getting them published. And today's guest is certainly no exception to this. You maybe have heard her name before. Today we have Ann Byrn. She's a New York Times bestselling food writer and author. She has written over, I believe, 15 or 16 cookbooks, including the ever-popular Cake Mix Doctor, A New Take on Cake, Skillet Love, and her newest book, Baking in the American South. In this beautiful book, Ann shares the stories and recipes from bakers all over the South, past and present, near and far, seen and unseen, all to answer the question, what makes Southern baking so special? During our conversation, Ann and I talk all about the land, people, and history of the South, along with her idea for the book and her process for collecting stories and testing recipes. Ann also shares the complicated role of sugar in the South, as well as the age-old question of how, if you don't live in the South, can you bake like a Southerner? Incidentally, if you're not a cook or baker, but you love to read cookbooks, this is a book you will definitely want to add to your collection, as it's filled with stories, history, memories, and snapshots of Southern ingredients, equipment, and baked goods, all as an ode to baking in the American South. So without further delay, let's dive into this interview with Ann Byrn. Hi, Ann. Welcome to the Cookbook Love podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes,
great
I'm
to
so
be here.
excited to have you here. Your beautiful new book, Baking in the American South. We've got so much to talk about. But before we dive in, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I am a food writer and cookbook author. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, my hometown. I haven't always lived in Nashville. I was in Georgia for about 20 years. I was the food editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for a good part of that. But we moved back when my kids were little, and I've raised a family here in Nashville, and I've really enjoyed it. And this is my new book, is my 16th book. And people say, well, how did you get into cookbooks? But I started writing for newspapers. I mean, newspapers were always my love. But I wrote The Cake Mix Doctor in 1999, and that kind of got me into cookbooks. That was wildly, popular. But through the years, I think as my kids have gotten older and I have too, I've become more interested in cookbooks that have more of a story behind the recipes. And so that's been great for me because it kind of satisfies my curiosity as a journalist. And it also allows me to develop sort of more writing skills and become more of a storyteller in the books that I do.
Yeah, I can't imagine the number of people that you came in contact with or got to talk to or be introduced to or even just learn about through the research and writing of this book.
It was a lot. In fact, I would wake up at night thinking, oh my gosh, I know I interviewed someone, and did I even put them in the book? And those were my worries because I felt like I really needed to talk to as many people as possible, and digging deep and finding people who could tell me first person stories or tell me about their mother. It was really important, but I've got all those notes and you can search it today, thankfully. So
yes, that's for sure. Well, why don't we start kind of like at the big picture, high level, talking about the American South, and then also a little bit about, of course, baking. And what is it about this whole U.S. regional styles of baking? What makes the South so different when you think about that?
Right. Well, the South is the South. And, what I did learn from this project was that our baking is based on the people and the land. So you think about the people and the land of the South are quite unique. And especially when they're in combination, the people on the land. And that is, they were the ones who created Southern baking. It gets really complicated from there. We have lots of port of entries. We have people who came here on their own volition and people who were forced to. We have women who, baked in their own kitchen out of love, and we have women who were baked because they had to. And I think that was a big part of the Southern baking story. And those cultural topics were tough to write about, but they had to be included. And I think, but historically, the South has preserved some of the oldest recipes, and we still make them today because we held on to them. And those early recipes, say 19th century recipes, went into cookbooks that were charitable cookbooks after the Civil War. And because of that, it preserved these recipes that were made in homes and handed down from mother to daughter. And I think that is what really makes the South unique. We were rural, we were isolated, and we were poor. And so we did not have the commercial bakeries in the urban centers that the North did after the Civil War. And people baked at home.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a whole different thing when you start to think historically about baking as a necessity.
Yes, definitely. And that's why I began the book with cornbread.
Yeah.
I say it's because cornbread feeds people. And I grew up with a very, economical grandmother who said, if you're still hungry, have a slice of bread, have another piece of bread. I mean, why is bread so important to the South? Because it fed people, it filled us up. Yeah.
I grew up in a big family, and my mom always had bread on the table, and we were a family of girls. But when my boys got older, she would say, if they're hungry, just put bread and butter on the table. And
there you go.
That's true. It's absolutely true. And it does fill them up, and they love it. And they always want to, have a slice of bread with their dinner.
Definitely.
Yeah. So why this book? Why did you decide to write this book?
Because I think it was the right time in my life to do it. And I had the opportunity to write a book on Southern baking, and I did not want to write a book about myself. I've always thought that other people are more interesting, and I love to hear other people's stories and then retell those. So I thought there's got to be a book that could be really wide sweeping, that would include all of the South. Very big-hearted book that would include people from the past as well as the present, and bring up topics that we all probably need to chew on and think about. And that's why I wrote this book. This was not a COVID project. It was after, it was probably started in 2021. But still, I was a little hampered in the beginning with actually visiting some places. I did a lot of interviews over the telephone in the beginning, and then finally kind of got out on the road. But I think I wrote this book because it felt right to me, and I felt like it was in me, and I had something to say.
Yeah. And I can't imagine the process and the sources. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what went into this book? You've mentioned a few things, talking to people, going out and visiting people, but there had to have been a lot deeper and wider process than that to include all the information that you did.
Oh, yeah. There was a lot of research in archives, and I list some acknowledgments, the librarians who helped me out, Library of Congress, the down in Tuscaloosa, the archive of David Walker Lupton collection of African-American cookbooks. In Vanderbilt, we have in the medical school here at Vanderbilt in Nashville, we have a fabulous collection of cookbooks that were donated through Neal Todhunter, who was a nutrition professor at the medical school many years ago. And then Marion Flexner, because she's from Kentucky, wrote for the Courier Journal for many years. Well, her son was a doctor at Vanderbilt, and so he donated his mother's papers and all of her cookbooks.
Wow.
And amazing. So going through the Marion Flexner boxes at Vanderbilt, and that's just kind of went on and on from there, knowing that I wanted to write and include some of the U.S. presidents who were from the South. Getting in touch with those presidential libraries was big, and they were helpful. I wanted to balance the book with people you'd heard of, such as Edna Lewis, perhaps, and John Edgerton, also Kentucky. But I wanted to bring in some stories that nobody had heard of before. Athelene Payton, perhaps from Louisville, but also not, Nina Kane from Florence, Alabama, who cooked in a family's home all her life, and her mother did as well, and that family's remembrances of her and how they went back into their history. That is the first recipe in the cornbread chapter, Nina Kane's Batty Cakes. They actually went back in their family's history and looked at old slave records and turned the names in to the local library and historical society so that anyone who was related to someone who had been enslaved on their cotton plantations could kind of put that puzzle piece into place in their family genealogy. That was important to me. Maggie Cox, who same was a domestic in the Delta of Mississippi, worked for a family for a long time. They've got a 3-ring binder in the kitchen that are Maggie's recipes, and photos of her, are still on the wall. Mm. So it was that kind of personal. I wanted to find those personal stories too, and some of them were just out of happenstance. The recipe for Ma Hoyle's blackberry double crust blackberry cobbler, that came out of a book signing. I was at a book signing with a previous book in North Carolina, and mentioned to the group who was there, they asked, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, I'm working on this book about baking in the South." And then this woman raised her hand, and she's from Ohio, and she says, "Well, what's so special about Southern baking?" And that got everybody in conversation, and it was fantastic. It got me thinking. It got everybody thinking. And then the woman at the bookstore, at the country bookshop, was so interested in it. She said, "I have to tell you about a recipe that's been in our family." And it was this blackberry cobbler. And it came from a family member who had a boarding house outside of Charlotte, North Carolina in the 1930s. And she had opened the boarding house because her husband had gotten ill, and she had to, raise the family and feed the family. So she rented out rooms in the house to lodgers. And she started cooking, frying chicken and making biscuits and making blackberry cobbler, and for the lodgers. And then she ended up, opening it up to the town. It was in the 1930s, and she had some of the first to-go boxes where people would take their meal home because you didn't waste anything in the 30s. So and then, thinking too, I wanted to make sure that I looked at different population groups. I mean, did I really understand how the Jews came into the South, and where did they settle? Where did they go? What did they do? Why did they come here? And so understanding that sort of immigration through Charleston up into upland South Carolina, and then through New Orleans as well. It really informed me. It was just fascinating. And then Texas is a whole completely different beast, because you've got the Germans and the Czech, settling in central Texas, the Kolaches from Texas. So I let the recipes tell the stories, but let the recipes tell the story, the people, and the land, and how the land, and that was a big education too, was really understanding why rice didn't grow anymore, and where wheat grows in the South, and how corn grew everywhere. And these were topics that I'd never ever concerned myself with. But when you're writing a book on baking, it's a big part of it, because baking is all about the flour and the sugar and that you're using in the recipes.
Yeah. And you mentioned let the recipes tell the story. And I think that's the answer to the question that the lady that raised her hand at the book signing had, like, what makes American, baking in the South so different? And you say, I think in your introduction, if it's not there, it's in part of the book where you just bake 3 or 4 of these different recipes and you'll have your answer to that question.
Yeah, that's the end, I think, of the introduction. I believe it's true. I mean, but that would be such a flip answer, I'm afraid, to this lady to say, "Well, haven't you tasted it? I mean, doesn't it speak for itself?"
Well, you mentioned a time when you were in, I know you don't focus it on yourself so much, but it's true. You were in an European country, you were going to have a slice of genoise, and you're like, okay, what I really want is a slice of pound cake.
Definitely. I mean, can you really beat a slice of pound cake, fresh, maybe a day old, been on the kitchen counter? No, you can't. The texture, the aroma. I mean, pound cake, the smell of pound cake baking is unlike anything else, really, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's butter, sugar, flour, and eggs. That's all it is. Maybe a little vanilla, but it's unlike anything. And you can see how people have become, and the Southerners are, I call pound cake a foundational recipe, in the South. Yeah. That and custards and pound cake, maybe angel food cake,
right?
But definitely pound cake.
Right. Did women tend to carry and do the heavy lifting for baking?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is not just a book about women, because I certainly have
Right.
many recipes in the book from men. But yeah, I mean, women's work has been in the home, in the kitchen. And I think that's why I find baking so fascinating, because it became a skill that women could have much more say than sewing, or, it was a skill. It was something they did well. They could sort of take it from there. Would they become a caterer? What did they do with it? I mean, you look at some of the successful women in the South, like Henrietta Dole, who was a food editor for the Atlanta Journal during the 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe part of the 50s. She was a wife and a mother, but had to, again, because of hard times, because of her husband's illness, she started making sandwiches and selling them. She started catering, and she started working for the Atlanta Gas Company. Then she wrote for the Atlanta Journal for decades and was the voice of the South, cooking demonstrations. It was what women did with cooking, which I found really fascinating. And Lena Richard, too, out of New Orleans. I mean, she was everything in the 1920s. I mean, she was on television, she was catering, she was teaching classes, and she would brought her daughter into the business to show her how to do it. And there was a lot. There was a lot of pride. There was, baking can be not only income producing, but it can be a source of pride. And I heard that over and over. The cake that someone would spend hours on to take to the church supper. It's a source of pride,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I bet you met some fascinating people and got to talk to them. You mentioned that you tried to have like firsthand accounts of somebody that knew somebody that did something. I'd love to know, in terms of the stories, the oldest person that you talked to during this, how far you had to travel to like get to some of these places.
Oh boy, the oldest person, I think in the 90s. I think I lost one person during this research.
Yeah.
I know I did. And the woman whose lean cake recipe is in the book, she has passed. Yeah, that was there. The tea cake recipe was one. I was really sick about that one, because I had tracked this woman down to, of all places, Clarksville, Tennessee, which is not that far from Nashville. And it was a tea cake recipe that she had in an old cookbook. And I was trying to find her. She had moved to Atlanta and was going to church at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And I tried to find her, and she had died just 2 months before. I mean, I think that came up from time to time. It was almost, some of the recipes, it was almost a race, really. And that's what was a big, the preservation of recipes was definitely a factor in me wanting to write this book, because I felt like if I didn't do it, how, who was going to? And I needed to get all of the meringue pie recipes in one place. And I needed to get some of the salt rising bread, get these recipes down and explain them to my kids' age, people in their 30s, so that they're there, because I don't think that unless they've made one, they don't know what an icebox pie is. And I know they've never
Did
never
you test
made
the recipe for the salt rising bread?
Oh, absolutely. I did.
Yeah.
It works. It's but it's a big science experiment.
It really is.
It's such a science experiment. And I highly recommend it to someone who needs a science experiment for school, because it really does work. And it's amazing. And it tastes great, and sliced and toasted with butter. It's so good. So delicious.
My parents were loyal to the brand Chevrolet. And when I grew up in central Kentucky, they would take their cars to Nicholasville, which was in Jessamine County, right across the county line, to get their cars. They bought them there and they got them serviced there. And there was a bakery in Nicholasville that made salt rising bread. So whenever Dad would take the car in to get it fixed or oil change, whatever he had to do, because he was not handy with the cars, he'd always went to that bakery and bought a couple loaves of salt rising bread. Of course, over the years, he'd say to my mom, why don't you try and make some of that? Mom would be like, Carl, you don't understand.
You're crazy.
Right. Just buy it at the bakery. There's other things I am willing to bake, but that is something that, but it is an amazing flavor. It's a unique way.
It's a funky, yeah.
It is funky. Yes.
It's very funky, and I think to describe it to everyone, if you don't know what self-rising bread is, it smells and tastes like toasted cheese, and when it's bubbling and fermenting and rising, it smells god awful. I mean, it's god awful, and really, it is. It's bacteria sort of reacting to cornmeal and potatoes to create your own yeast starter. It's just foul smelling stench. But once you can get past that and you work the flour into it, and the smell is gone, it's miraculous that, and how ingenious people were that they could make bread just out of anything.
Yeah. And I think for people that maybe are listening that have gotten onto a sourdough kick, they understand the process behind that. I think that this is kind of like the next step, to use other ingredients to ferment, like the potatoes and the cornmeal, rather than just flour.
Definitely. Yeah.
What was it like testing the recipes for this book, Anne?
It was a lot. It was, over a couple of years, really. It was a lot, and there were recipes that I really, really, really wanted to work, and it just didn't work. And then there was some I really wanted to work because I had never heard of the recipe, like the cantaloupe cream pie, the recipe and that's kind of an old railroad recipe. Is how sort of an ingenious, railroad cook took a case of cantaloupe and made, a meringue pie out of it. So I think kind of making that work in today's kitchen was a huge challenge. How do we know if the cantaloupe is ripe or it's going to be half ripe when someone's using it? So what can we do? We can cut up squares and we can put it in the microwave and we can soften it. So then it'll be as if it's more ripe. Because what you really want is the juice, and you're going to use the juice of the cantaloupe to make a custard on top of the stove. And that's what goes in the pie. And then you pile the meringue on top. So it was those kind of using our noggin to help older recipes along so that people might be more encouraged to bake them. That was the challenge.
Yeah. And over a course of a couple of years, baking and testing, and some recipes, don't work. And were those recipes that were maybe more historic or cryptically written in nature, or was it just a function of that some ingredients weren't available, things just didn't work for?
It was a mix of things, but I think some of the recipes I wanted to work just turned out to be too time consuming as well for the average person, because say with something like a caramel pie, caramel, which is absolutely delicious, but you go through the process of caramelizing the white sugar to turn dark, and then you've got to take that syrup and cool it and make the custard. And we got to where it's like, nobody's going to do this, and it's so many steps. Whereas the recipe from Kentucky, that brown sugar meringue pie, there you go, bam. That is from a family. They've got the story. They're tobacco farmers, and that recipe is a caramel pie. But they're just starting with brown sugar. I think it's just ingenious. Right? And yes, and that's kind of, we slid in a lot of those because I think people like that. You're going to get the same flavor, but you don't have to caramelize the sugar. Yeah.
So speaking of sugar has a complicated story in Southern baking. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because I know you covered this a lot in the book.
Yeah, I do. Kind of, sugar's the bad boy, but sugar can be so good, And a lot of people believe Southern recipes are so sweet. I believe it's true. They are, many of them. I did take kind of special note with some of the recipes to reduce some of the sugar, and I talk about that in the recipe note, the head note, because I felt like the sugar needed to come down. But sugar was something that Southerners had access to. Or they had access to sorghum for sweetening, molasses, and so that is just another part of Southern baking. I mean, it is the land. It is what we had access to and what we were able to use. And then when time, with war rationing and embargoes over sugar, sugar became unavailable to a lot of people. And it was those recipes they clung on to, like sugar cookies, like a butter cake, pound cakes. That's when you kind of learn that, how dear sugar was to families when they didn't have it. And I talk about that as well. But sugar has been called slave sugar by the abolitionists of our country. The Quakers would not bake with white sugar. So I think that there has been a feeling in America that white sugar, really is a symbol of slavery. And I do talk about the sugarcane industry as I talk about the rice industry, and how, just how cruel both of them were, and how the enslaved were just worked in terrible conditions to produce these products. And a lot of people got really, really wealthy as a result. So sugar is complicated. It's necessary in recipes. It can definitely be reduced in many recipes and how we bake today. And I think we have a love-hate relationship with sugar right now. I think that, people realize that we maybe eat too much of it. We need to cut back on it. But some of these recipes are not going to work without sugar. And that is, sugar is gives tenderness to cakes. It promotes browning. It has a role in baking, and it feeds yeast in bread baking. So that's how I looked at sugar in this book. Just square head on.
Yeah, I mean, because you had to. I mean, you can't write this book without it. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But I think the awareness and the honesty about it is the story that does need to be told these days. So it's I think for such an important ingredient, it's time to see it, talked about in that way, and
right.
Appreciate that for sure. So we are, heading into the fall. Holidays are coming up. Holidays have helped Southern baking a lot. Tell me a little bit about what you learned about some holiday traditions or things that were going on in the kitchen during the holidays in the South.
Well, yeah. Well, I know that something called boiled custard is very popular in Mississippi, parts of Alabama, Tennessee. What about Kentucky?
Yeah, my grandmother actually made it. They would keep it in the refrigerator if somebody was sick too. That was what they would drink.
Ooh, how delicious. Yeah, I fell in love with boiled custard in the process of writing this book. Yes. Absolutely loved it. I made the milk punch of New Orleans. Yeah, and I've made eggnog. We have a family eggnog recipe in our family. But boiled custard was something my dad really liked. And I think boiled custard often appealed to teetotalers in the South, who were not going to add a shot of bourbon. And when you had ladies over for cakes or whatever, and boiled custard could be served, and maybe with angel food cake, because the whites could be used in angel food cake and the yolks could be used in making boiled custard. So I did talk about that and a good bit about fruitcake and the fruitcake traditions in the South. Whether you love fruitcake or not, I mean, it's a big part of Southern baking during the holidays. So I had a good time kind of reliving some fruitcake moments, running a recipe for Mrs. Mosel's fruitcake that came out of the Jackson, Mississippi Symphony Cookbook. And it was a favorite recipe of Eudora Welty's. So I do love that. And then there's a recipe for Christmas black cake, which is out of New Orleans, Nina Compton recipe, and it has roots in the Caribbean. And I think it really kind of tells us the stories of how New Orleans and other port cities were affected and influenced by Caribbean flavors and the peoples and the Creole peoples and bakers of New Orleans. So that for sure. I loved the mountain stories, I think, too, how much people scrimped and saved to bake holiday cakes, how gingerbread was such an important cake of the mountains. So East Kentucky, West Virginia, the mountains of Virginia, how important gingerbread was. Any kind of spice cake, the blackberry jam cake that's known in in Kentucky and Tennessee, I think is fascinating cake, and it's linked to German settlers who came through. It's a Christmas cake. The Lane cake of South southwestern Georgia and southeastern Alabama is President Jimmy Carter's favorite cake at Christmas. Yeah, I think that, throughout the South, there were these Christmas references and they kept popping up. Certain recipes kept popping up. Cookies too. Yeah.
Yeah. Cookies. I mean, you can't talk about the holidays without talking about cookies. And I've talked a lot about cookies on this podcast with various authors of cookie books, like all about cookies. And, those take on a whole different tune during the holidays than a big cake. But I suspect that houses that bake during the holidays probably had a little bit of both.
I think so too.
And a special cake. Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah, I share our family crescent cookies, which is the Christmas cookie. And something I ran across years ago was just a thought, is that the holidays preserve what the everyday loses. And holiday recipes have stayed around, and we've hung on to them because of the memories that the recipes hold and the people they represent, and maybe carrying on a tradition because the people before us are gone, and we need to bake these cookies, and we need our children to know what this is. So that has been another part of the preservation, I believe, of a lot of these Christmas cakes and Christmas cookies. I mean, they're fussy, but they've been preserved because they've been baked every year.
Yeah. Did you run across any recipes that you had to get access to that were not already documented, that you talked to a cook or someone who knew the cook and you actually created the recipe after watching it be prepared?
Yeah, well, I created a recipe after someone told me about the recipe. So there was a family in Georgia, from Dalton, Georgia, and their grandmother made a lemon cake every year for Christmas, and it was called a sticky lemon cake. And I knew when they told me that name, I said, whoa. And where was she from in Georgia? And they said she was from Columbus, which is right down there near Americus, which is down in that sticky lemon cheesecake / lane cake territory of the South. And I went, I know that cake. And I said, did it have like a lemon curd filling in between the layers? Yes, it did. I said, did it have a boiled white icing or did you put whipped cream on it? Oh, boiled white icing. So there had been a similar recipe in my American Cake book from a tea room in Atlanta, Francis Virginia Tea Room. And it was a lemon sponge cake, I believe it was called. But it was that lemon cheesecake, that sticky lemon cheesecake. So I created a recipe, sent it to the family. They made it. They loved it. And they thanked me for bringing it back. The other was I mentioned Nina Kane from Florence, Alabama, the family who she cooked for. They had tried to duplicate her batty cakes, which I think also has a Kentucky connection to the Derby. That'd be something that we could, but it's like a corn griddle cake, and they called them batty cakes, and Batty, and they had never been able to. So we, in Nashville, there were a couple restaurants here, steakhouses that used to make corn cakes, and you go in and get a steak, and you always get a pile of corn cakes with it. And so I did create as close as I could to that family recipe as well.
Yeah. Yeah, by just talking to people. And it's fascinating that the lemon, and we talk about sticky lemon, you almost could visualize where this part of the South was. And, something happened down there, though, to make that part of just what people made and talked about. Just like bananas. We talked about some of the ingredients that are unique to the South, but don't grow in the South. Bananas.
Yes, exactly. Bananas, fascinating.
Right. Now, lemons and oranges obviously do grow in parts of Florida, but there are some things that it's just how did these make it into the foodways here in the South?
Well, that lemon, and I do say that lemon pie recipe, the shaker lemon pie, that is not native to, Kentucky. And I do talk about that
Yeah.
in the recipe head note. Yeah, that actually came from another Shaker cookbook, but it became a tradition in Kentucky because they said, the Shakers would have not had access to lemons.
Right.
They would have had to go. But, lemons came in, they were imported. You see a lot of lemons in New Orleans recipes. That's what lemon icebox pie is, right out of Louisiana. So lemons were imported, and they were from Sicily. And a lot of the fruit packers in New Orleans and Louisiana were Sicilians who came over here for jobs. So and has been a sizable Sicilian population in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that influenced. Lemons were everywhere. Lemons came into Charleston as well. They were, it was an upper crust ingredient, just like dried fruit and candied fruit. To be able to have citrus and bake with it was a privilege.
The other one that comes to mind is pineapple.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Pineapple. Yeah. Same thing. Tropical fruit was a sign of hospitality throughout colonial America, but it was a sign of prestige and privilege is what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if someone listening that doesn't live in the South, what kind of advice would you give them about baking like someone from the South?
Read the introduction to my book. And I think it'll really help because I talk about the core ingredients of Southern baking. And that's the good thing about, today. I mean, you don't have to live in the South to bake like a Southerner. I mean, you can access Southern flours. I have a whole, some information at the beginning on flour and protein counts of flour and how much gluten is in which flour. And, and so if you can see that, you can see how you could swap out flours in biscuit recipes to kind of, reduce the amount of protein that's in them by adding cake flour to them. So I think that's really, really great to know. The other thing is that just to read the story and make the recipe as it is, you might learn something. It might be, you may taste something that you haven't tasted before. I think that's or you may taste something that you remember from a trip, or maybe there's a relative of yours who made a recipe and it reminds you of something. I spoke with a man who's in San Francisco, but his grandparents were from Arkansas. And he was most intrigued with the cornbread recipes because he really hadn't had that type of cornbread since they were alive. So,
yeah.
It's
the cornbread chapter in and of itself it's a great read, and it's talks about the whole thing, and of course in the South and the North, flour, cornmeal, sugar, no sugar, lots of different little things that people talk about, plus just the ways that it's made. It's it can be cakes,
definitely
hot water cornbread, kind in a pan. I mean, it's just like lots and lots of different varieties. I think one thing about the recipes that amazed me about this book is that the sources, I'm going to read this from the introduction, were as diverse as the recipes themselves. They came from department stores, school cafeterias, tea rooms, boarding houses, historic homes, cookbooks, churches, synagogues, restaurants, farms, mills, pastry shops, catering kitchens, home kitchens, and even the White House. So these aren't recipes that just rose up out of homes only. I mean, they're literally all across the board.
Definitely.
Food, the mills that actually made the flour to, like you mentioned, the boarding houses and the double crust blackberry cobbler.
Yeah. And I thought it was important too that I included some modern day recipes where pastry chefs have riffed on Southern, such as Alison Vaughn's recipe in the pie chapter for a citrus, chess pie. Her people had come from Virginia, and she wanted, but she has this fabulous bake shop in Jacksonville, 1748 Bakehouse. And she, why not use orange juice and lemon juice in a chess pie recipe instead of vinegar? I mean, you're in Florida, for goodness sake. So that really intrigued me. And then the roll recipe in the yeast roll chapter from the Optimist restaurant, which is in Nashville. It's in Atlanta. There's some other locations, but oh my God, their rolls are fantastic. And they're like They're like a Sally Lunn type bread, a really rich roll, but they've got honey in them. And so there's a little bit of honey, and they're served with honey on top. So I love that recipe, and I scaled that down from a food service size down to something that's more manageable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as we're starting to wrap up, one of the final types of breads that we haven't talked about specifically was biscuits. I think a lot of people think about South and they think of biscuits. You started the book with cornmeal, but let's talk for just a minute about biscuits and what you learned about biscuits in the South.
Wow. I learned that everybody's got their own, got their own opinion about biscuits. I mean, you've got Natalie Debris, who, starts with self-rising flour and, adds cream to them. You've got people like a Bellegarde biscuit in New Orleans, where you're mixing a little bit of cornmeal with the flour. Really unique taste. You've got lard in some biscuits. You've got just butter. Scott Peacock in Marion, Alabama. I mean, he is just the biscuit king for sure. And to how he uses really, really high heat, a shaggy biscuit dough, docks the dough like Edna Lewis did with a fork to let steam escape. All of his little tricks are in the book. I think it's really, he's just been just an artist when it comes to biscuits. But there's some other peculiar different ones. There's a lemon biscuit from South Carolina. There's a cheese biscuit that's fabulous from Thomasville, Georgia. So I think with biscuits, it's really trying some recipes, figuring out what you like. Do you like a biscuit that's soft and fluffy? Use vegetable shortening as the fat. If you like a biscuit with more layers that has more flavor, maybe a little bit more golden color, use butter as the fat. You could do a mix of the both of them. So the flour you like, the type of fat, and then use plenty of liquid. Use what the recipe calls for, but I mean, the liquid is there to really hydrate that flour. And, if it's buttermilk or if it's sweet milk, whichever one it is, the biscuit dough should be somewhat shaggy. I think that's something I learned too. And then, I didn't say also to incorporate the fat into the flour with your fingers, with your hands. Get your finger and sort of smoosh it in. You can kind of create little discs, almost discs of fat in the flour. So that when you start working the dough, folding it over gently, you're kind of layering in that fat. It's a little bit like making a pie crust, a little bit, because it's the same sort of touching it, but not too much, patting it out straight down with cutters and a hot oven. I'm talking 450. Yeah. Hot oven, because that's where you're going to have the best rise.
Yeah. And did you find across the board that people use a certain type of flour for their biscuits?
Some are particular and some are not, like Stella Parks from Lexington, very particular about gold medal. But the reason she uses gold medal is because she feels like it's just very consistent. And she told me when she writes a recipe, if it's a biscuit recipe, she wants it to be successful to everybody, anywhere. And gold medal is consistent, I'll have to say. And so I think that Scott Peacock, I believe, uses King Arthur unbleached flour. So, some are very specific and some are a little bit more, use what you like. White Lily, Carrie Morey, White Lily, Shirley Carrier, White Lily, Natalie's White Lily. Yeah. Come to think of it, I'd say it's 50-50 split on being, brand specific on biscuit flour.
And I would guess what's more important there is if a certain recipe is in the book here, like we wouldn't say one type of flour for all the biscuits, just follow the type of flour that is mentioned in the recipe, because it was developed, and tested with that specific type of flour. Because King Arthur probably tends to be higher protein.
Yes.
Gold medal, more middle of the road. And then, of course, White Lily, a soft flour.
That's correct.
Yeah, that would be a lower protein flour.
Yeah, but I think definitely the more you bake biscuits, the better you get. And I don't you agree?
Oh, totally.
I feel much more confident about biscuits than I ever have in my life, and it's from testing all of these recipes. Right. Yeah.
Same for making a pie crust, and really a lot of the things that you do when you bake. Might take, it takes a little skill. And like you said, people were very proud of that accomplishment. They They
Yeah.
had a cake that they made all the time. They knew how to make the cake. They got known for making that cake. I love the story
Hmm.
you told about, women sometimes they need a little extra money. They might take one to the beauty shop and sell a cake, or they would sell cakes.
Definitely.
And it really was a way of life, baking was, for people not only to share, but also to create some income for the family.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, one of the questions I like to ask as we're wrapping up is talk about cookbooks, since we're here on Cookbook Love Podcast. If you have a favorite cookbook that
Oh,
you have
wow.
just over the years, I'm sure you've used many, but if any stand out to you as one that you either relied on in your professional work or
Hmm.
with your family.
Wow. Wow. Well, yeah, I have a lot of cookbooks too, but one that really stood out with the research for this book is Bill Neal's cookbook, Bill Neal's Southern Cooking. It was written in 1985. And what I like about it is how he writes recipes and how he's very meticulous. He was very meticulous about recipe writing. He's very detailed, but the storytelling is quite unique. And the head notes are they make you want to make the recipe. And then think too, he sort of dives into topics that are unknown. And I think you will be, anyone, if you get a hands on that book, will be just surprised at what he uncovers through history. He did a lot of research. He was a scholar before he was a cook. And so I really like Bill Neal's Southern Cookbook a lot.
Very good. I will link to that in the show notes. So, Anne,
Sounds
we wish
good.
you nothing but the best with the promotion of your beautiful book. Again, if there's anyone listening that is a cookbook reader, you need to get your hands on a copy of this book so you can read it. Just such a joy to read. And why don't you tell everybody how they can connect with you online?
Sounds great. Well, they can go to my website, which is Anne Byrn, ANNEBYRN.com, or they can follow me on Instagram at Anne Byrn. Yeah.
And you also have a Substack newsletter, correct?
Oh, I do. Thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me,
Yeah,
Maggie.
tell
Yes.
everybody a little bit about. I haven't talked a ton about Substack on this
Uh-huh.
podcast, but for someone, tell us a little bit about your newsletter, and I would
Mhm.
love for you to maybe just mention, what does it do for you as a cook and a baker and a professional, and as
Mhm.
someone who loves, talking about food.
Right,
Yeah, tell us about
right.
your Substack.
Yeah, so my Substack is called Between the Layers. I've written it about 3.5 years. So I started writing it in spring of 21. I really, really enjoyed the process. In the beginning, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just writing. I said, I'm just going to write on all these different topics, and whichever one gets the most feedback, then I'll realize that's what people want to read. And then they started having some other little tricks, bells and whistles. And so you could, insert a poll. So I started inserting polls and asking people questions and what they really wanted to read. And then I kind of settled into, well, but this is what I want to write.
Yeah.
And I found that I was happiest when I was writing what I want to write. And because I do a lot of writing, for on cookbooks, this was a huge project. So when it came to writing a newsletter, it really needs to be something that's near and dear to my heart, or it's time to the time of year or the weather, whatever. It's just something that appeals to me. I have loved it because of the people I've met, the other writers I've met. I have loved, loved, loved. It's stretched me, I think, as a cook, because I've tried to bake things like Basque cheesecake. I had never baked a Basque cheesecake, and I thought, I think it's time. So I think it's been. I made no churn ice cream. Just certain things that I'm going to do this, and I think that's what's great about a newsletter, because you can. Nobody's telling you have to write this topic. You have to do this. You decide, and whatever interests you. So I think as a cook, and I've been writing about food for over 40 years, it keeps me fresh,
Yeah.
and I stay interested. And then the other flip side is it's a lot of writing. So I think it helps if you enjoy writing or you want to get into a new type of writing. It has helped me write more creatively. And I started taking a creative writing class. as well, because I was inspired, because I've written so many recipes all my life. I don't want to just end my life just having written recipes. Maybe there's something out there. Maybe there's more that I can write. I want to find. The newsletter is a great way to explore that and explore something you're curious about. Yeah.
Yeah. And in your particular career, a blog was never part of your landscape.
It was during the time that when blogs were starting. I wasn't interested. And I think it was my kids were going through a really busy time. I had a teenager still in the house. I had a couple other things. I had some books to work on. I just wasn't interested in getting into the blogs. And so much of the blogs was, your SEO and all of that, because with a blog, you have got to get people to you. Mm-hmm. That's a big important thing. You got to get people to you. So how are you going to get people to you? How are they going to find out about you? What really interested me about Substack was that, number one, I had a pretty good sized email list that I'd had accumulated through the years. And I didn't have to pay a monthly fee to MailChimp to send these newsletters out. If anything, I might write something interesting and someone might want to pay me. They think what I'm doing is a good thing and they want to be a paid subscriber. I don't make a lot of money in paid subscriptions. I make enough to kind of keep it interesting. I'm definitely not one of those like top performers, who, are just like have a great lifestyle, just off the Substack. I'm not there yet. And I think I would be nice, but I think it's just what I write about appeals to people who are accustomed to free content, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
And and I get it, because there's a lot of things I read free as well.
That's right.
So that's a lot of round information about Substack, but it's been a great experience. I have learned, I have grown, and I'm really glad I've done it.
Yeah. How often do you publish your newsletter?
I publish once a week, but it's every other week, for free, every week for paid.
Yeah.
So a paid subscriber hears from me every Tuesday, and a free subscriber twice a month.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I think it's a great platform, and in particular, like you said, if people are looking to hone their writing, like really tune into what it is they like to write, sharing information from that perspective with an audience, it's great. And there is no fee for the user. It's fascinating that they've kept it. Free, right?
Yeah. And the nichier, the better, I think that's another thing, if you've got a niche, if you just love preserving, or if you love writing about your garden that, is in North Carolina, the more niche you can be, the better.
Yeah.
Really the better. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So we'll link to that also. That's Between the Layers for your Substack newsletter. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, we wish you again nothing but the best with the promotion of your book. I have a feeling you're going to have a busy fall talking about it. I'm sure I've subscribed to magazines. Here I get Gardening Guns, Southern Living. I'm sure I'll probably see some Ann Byrn pop up there. I can't wait until I do. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you so much for sharing not just your expertise, like you said, but the stories and the expertise of these bakers all across the South who have really just amassed such a story about something that's very important. And your book is a great record of that work. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Maggie. Appreciate it so much.
All right. Well, have a great day.
You too.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. Again, all the links can be found in the show notes at www.cookbooklove.co. And if you are interested in writing a cookbook of your own, please check out the free cookbook writing masterclass called How to Get Paid to Write a Cookbook. It is designed specifically for food or nutrition experts, and you can check that out at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So that's it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. And until next time, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.